Re-releases, remakes, definitive editions. What do all of these have in common? They want your money! In all seriousness, I do think the idea of re-releasing games is completely fine on its own. Just like any piece of media, games require just as, if not more resources, to even make it out of the market. That, and considering how beloved yet difficult some games can be to preserve, why not just repackage them with extra content for a full price? It's a pretty clever strategy, if I do say so myself. However, there's no other franchise that fully took advantage of this more than Persona. Persona has a huge history of having its original release, with a brand new edition replacing it a few years down the line. Now then, why am I saying all this? Well, Persona 3 Reload, alongside many of Atlus's recent releases, have adapted a new practice. Rather than making a brand new game with tons of new content, they opted to include a separate DLC campaign. Basically, instead of waiting for a couple of years for a newer and shinier version of a game, you can now buy this expansion separately for an extra price. Usually these DLC campaigns are promoted as their own little narrative while utilizing the same mechanics that were introduced in the main story. I've seen a lot of people discuss whether or not this is a good idea, though I don't think I've ever seen anyone really tackle the discussion so thoroughly before. So that's what I'm here to do. With the release of The Answer as part of P3 Reload's expansion pass on the way, I thought there's no better time than to ask ourselves, are these DLC campaigns ideal moving forward? Just what are the pros and cons of this over a definitive edition in the style of Persona 5 Royal? Well, I guess there's only one way to find out. Be sure to grab your Aigis toaster and burn that bread, cause this is our look back to Atlus release. And as always, before we start, I just want to say that if you're enjoying our productions, or you want to see more Persona-related stuff from us, be sure to press that subscribe button. And while you're at it, be sure to check out our Patreon to further help grow the channel. With that said, let's begin. In order to understand what caused this sudden shift in handling their re-releases, we must understand why they even chose to make them in the first place. You see, way before DLC and patches were remotely possible, games didn't have any other way to add more content to games they had already released. You couldn't patch a game-breaking bug or add extra content later down the line once it was on the shelves. This is why it was a very common practice to republish the same game, but with extra bells and whistles as the main selling point. New characters to play as, new cosmetics, or just fun Easter eggs were some of the things publishers used to incentivize consumers. In all honesty, it's quite a smart strategy. Not only does this give us an even more polished version of a game with more stuff to do, it can also bring in potential new fans who missed out on the original. Atlus knew this very well, and so you can tell that they made this with almost every big release of theirs. During the mid to late 2000s, Persona was starting to experience its first signs of success, further incentivizing Atlus to make newer versions of these existing titles. Persona 4 got Golden, Persona 3 got FES and Portable, heck, even their spin-offs were getting the same treatment. What's most fascinating, though, is just how long they've kept this up. Even as late as 2019, we were still getting plenty of re-releases announced and published all at once. Catherine Full Body, TMS Encore, Persona 5 Royal, all of these were announced and/or released in that same year. Though, it wasn't all great. Around 2018 to 2020, Atlus was getting a bit greedy, to say the least. Even though they were making it clear that they were sticking to re-releasing their games, they decided to offer Day 1 DLC on top of said games. This and many other of their practices never really sat well with their fans. Whatever the case is, they fortunately did get back on track and found a good method to sell their new content, right? It's a little complicated. After the release of Royal, Atlus was just kind of experimenting with whatever worked at that point. We got TMS Encore, a re-release of Tokyo Mirage Sessions, and it was decent. It was great for people who never played the game, but it didn't offer too much for people who already have. At most, you were paying for an extra 10 hours of new content, which you get way later in the game. Then we had Persona 5 Strikers, a game which you'd assume would be amazing for extra content or a new story, but surprisingly, other than some basic things like items and music, there's been no re-release or anything special made separately. And that's considering this game sold over 1 million copies. You'd think that at the very least they would make a playable Akechi and Sumi for New Game Plus, but no. They straight up moved on. Then we got a remastered version of SMT Nocturne. This time there was no re-release, instead the content that was included in its original release, alongside other things, was now sold separately as DLC. This also didn't sit well with a lot of people. And of course, it left Atlus scratching their heads once again. Just how can they possibly include extra content in their games in a way that's profitable, but also attractive for their audience? Well, they kind of found a solution to that. May I present to you Soul Hackers 2. See, Soul Hackers 2 was the first to do something that Atlus hadn't really done before. Instead of just making DLC that essentially boils down to cosmetics and items, they also developed a completely new side campaign alongside the main story. As mentioned earlier, this was promoted as an optional side mission that has its own narrative, and a small yet unique mechanic to make it stand out from the base game. Despite Soul Hackers 2 being Soul Hackers 2, this didn't stop Atlus from still experimenting with the concept with their upcoming projects either. Persona 5 Tactica got a similar treatment with Repaint Your Heart, and Persona 3 Reload is using the Answer campaign from FES as DLC. Now that we understand the point in time and reasoning Atlus chose to do this, we can now discuss what this means for their releases going forward. At its core, this is a very interesting alternative. One thing to keep in mind is that while these re-releases are nice and do offer a new overall experience, it does in a way incentivize people to not get the original version at launch. Why get the original Persona 5 in 2017 if Atlus is just going to make an even better version in 2 to 3 years? Back when Persona 5 Royal was first announced, I remember seeing a lot of new fans, including myself, being very against this. The only times I see this kind of practice justified is when there's a jump in console generation, or the game itself is being repackaged for all platforms. So, in a way, making the new content DLC does in fact do a lot of good that people don't seem to realize. There's no longer that expectation of a new game replacing it, so that just means more people would be likely to check it out. Plus, by adding small patches and updates to it over time, it just helps the game stay relevant for way longer. Say what you want of Reload's roadmap, but it's undeniably a very good strategy. Releasing new content over the span of a full year like this can greatly help in the long run. That's not even mentioning how they can use these DLC campaigns as a way to tell new stories too. With the exception of the Answer, the new content in these Persona re-releases tends to not feel as natural compared to the original version. This is just a fundamental flaw when making these re-releases. At the end of the day, things like Sumi and Marie were additions made for a story that was perfectly fine as is. For that alone, it's a miracle how well they actually ended up working in the end. So making these extra narratives, almost like optional side quests, is actually a really good way to fix the problem. That's not even mentioning the actual quality these campaigns can offer. Repaint Your Heart is the best example of this. New story, original music, new mechanic that fleshes out the core gameplay, whole different cast to follow, all in its own atmosphere separate from the status quo. I feel like Persona as a franchise can greatly benefit from smaller scaled stories like this. With all this said and done, you may be wondering now, why do people hate this DLC practice then? It seems to be pretty much the perfect evolution of the re-releases they've done in the past, so why are people so against them? The discussion of whether or not they should stick to these side campaigns as DLC has so far been very complicated. I've seen a lot of people absolutely shame Atlus for doing this, mostly stemming from the fact that these DLC bundles are usually made alongside the actual game, which is a valid criticism. Even though DLC campaigns like this aren't anything groundbreaking, they're still released years after the base game. In the end, just making one alongside and also selling it day one can leave some people with a bad taste in their mouth. There's also the whole discussion on how these expansions would even be preserved. It's not that hard to imagine a timeline where Repaint Your Heart isn't available anymore, and with how poorly that game's done, it's hard to see it getting a re-release in the first place. Though I'd argue the biggest culprit is due to how poorly executed a lot of their past attempts have been. Soul Hackers 2's Lost Numbers campaign was mostly made up of one dungeon with a few bosses just being reused, but with a new coat of paint. Already off to a bad start, sadly. As for Persona 3 Reload's case, its expansion pass was announced after the fact you could pre-order what was already called the Premium Bundle, meaning if you bought it before the expansion pass was announced, you'd have to spend another $30 for it. Now, I don't know about you, but actively screwing over your audience like that is not a good look, to say the least. And while yes, Tactica did do this entire practice the best by announcing its DLC and bundling it in the Digital Deluxe Edition, barely anyone cared about it. I'm more than confident to say that if Atlus didn't try to be so greedy during 2018 to 2020, stuck to a decent strategy like they did with Tactica, I don't think there would be as many people hating on them for this kind of stuff. At the end of the day, all I can say is, be smart with how you spend. Hopefully future releases figure out what they'll do with their DLC and re-releases. Only time will tell. But what do you guys think? Should Atlus continue doing campaigns like The Answer, or should they continue re-releases moving forward? Let us know in the comments below. Now, if you excuse me, I am off to find a new place for myself. I hear Futaba's Palace has a pretty decent town to stay in. This is Akari Oe from Mintjoy Pictures. God, they announced a Joker cameo for Persona 3 Reload?
Shut up and take my money!